afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us for History in Motion, the Many Lives of Washington's First Purpose-Built Synagogue. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who are unfamiliar with DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic and built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. So I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite free public programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Denton's, Douglas Development, Antudovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to preservation in the city. And with that, I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's presenter. Jonathan Edelman serves as the Curatorial Associate at the Lillian and Albert Small Capital Jewish Museum. In this role, Jonathan oversees the museum's collection and works with the content team creating the main exhibits for the new museum. He came to the Capital Jewish Museum after completing a master's in museum studies at the George Washington University, and working for 2 years in the Film, Oral History, and Recorded Sound Division of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. A native of Kansas City, Jonathan has called the district home for the past 5.5 years. So with that, I'm so excited to pass things along to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm very excited to be here. Let me just share my screen one moment. Awesome. So before we begin, though we are virtual, today we're going to be speaking about Washington, DC, which sits on the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway and Anacostan people. I want to acknowledge the painful history of forced removal from this land, but also honor the many indigenous people that still are connected to this land and call it home. I'm really excited to be doing this presentation in particular because when I was talking with Melissa about the DCPL audience, she encouraged me to get into the nitty-gritty details on everything from wainscoting restoration to the bureaucratic minefield of preservation efforts. And so it was really fun putting this project together because I got to dive in a lot more than I normally do. So in order to better understand the history of Washington's first purpose-built synagogue, I actually want to begin by providing a little context to the Jewish community that helped create it. The story of this community illustrates the unique opportunities and obligations of a local community living on a national stage. That national stage, of course, being Washington, DC. It is divided into 4 clearly unevenly distributed quadrants, northeast, northwest, southeast, and southwest, the center point being the capital. Oftentimes when we think of immigrant Jewish communities, if we think about them, we think of places like the Lower East Side in Manhattan, large concentrations of immigrants in one neighborhood of the city. This was not the case for the Jewish immigrants of Washington. Jews lived and worked in all 4 quadrants, including places like 8th Street in Northeast, 4.5 Street in Southwest, and Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington Highlands, a few places in Southeast. Today, our focus will be on Northwest, specifically the 7th Street neighborhood, which raised generations of early Jewish Washingtonians. The 7th Street neighborhood became the city's main business district and really a center for Jewish residential and religious life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many German-speaking Jewish immigrants got their start on 7th Street. Several Jewish merchants with shops along 7th Street expanded them into fashionable department stores, including Hecht's, Landsberg's, Kahn's, some you may be familiar with. By the 1890s, Russian immigrants began moving into the area and opening small businesses of their own. But the Jewish community not only worked here, but lived and prayed in the 7th Street neighborhood as well. So the story of Washington's Jewish community is slightly later than other major cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And this has to do in part with geography. We are not a port city. No immigrant simply landed here. And so they came later, but they also often came with intention, often to serve in the federal government. The Civil War, New Deal, World War II, all brought job opportunity and thus grew not only the Jewish population in DC, but the wider community as well. This Jewish population, though small in its early years, expanded rapidly. 200 Jews existed in the city before the Civil War, but by the war's end, the number was closer to 2,000. There was just one congregation inside the federal city serving this growing Jewish community. So in order to tell the story of the historic Adas Israel Synagogue, we actually have to begin with a different congregation, the first congregation, which is Washington Hebrew congregation. Congress, rather than a city council, governed Washington, D.C. during the 19th century. Laws and changes to those laws had to be passed by Congress, a unique situation for us Washington residents. On June 17th, 1844, a congressional act gave permission for religious congregations to own and manage their own property in the federal district. But with vivid memories of government persecution of Jews in Europe, the pioneer members of Washington Hebrew were concerned that this 1844 act only applied to churches and not to synagogues. So they ensured the introduction and passage of this bill that you see here, the Senate bill that is aptly named an act for the benefit of the Hebrew congregation in Washington, that established the legal right of Jewish congregations to own property. President Franklin Pierce signed it into the bill into law on June 2nd, 1856. This showed a lot of these early Jewish immigrants that the government they now lived under respected their faith in ways many of them likely never saw in Europe. Shortly after the passage of this act, the congregation purchased and converted this Methodist church at 8th and I Street Northwest into a synagogue, and it served the Jewish community throughout the Civil War. Quickly to round things out, with Washington Hebrew, the congregation tore down the church and built their own synagogue in 1898. Now you'll hear me say quite often, first purpose-built synagogue. Washington Hebrew was the first congregation in DC, but they didn't actually build their own synagogue until 1898. Addis, this other congregation, built it in 1876. So that's why we say first purpose-built. So hopefully no one's feelings are hurt. They remained in this building at 8th and I Street until the middle of the 20th century, a time that saw much of the Jewish community move out of downtown Washington. After Washington Hebrew left in the 1950s, Greater New Hope Baptist Church moved in, and they occupy the same building to this day. One of the greatest advantages of being a pedestrian walking around DC is that history always surrounds you, thanks in part to the work of organizations like DC Preservation League. In many cases, the buildings offer clues to their own past right on the facade, and Greater New Hope is no exception. Just under the sign, you see these Star of Davids carved into the facade, which is remains from the original synagogue design, and it speaks to the power of the built environment as a means of teaching history. But I digress. Let's go back to the original story, Addis. As I mentioned before, the Jewish population in DC went from 200 to 2,000 by the end of the Civil War. And with that came a wider variety of opinions, shall we say. Thus, shortly after the war, drama began to unfold in Washington Hebrew. Traditional practices in the congregation soon gave way to religious reforms. Things like English and German prayers instead of strictly Hebrew, women and men sitting together in worship, which was not common, especially among Orthodox. And in the end, it was music that was the last straw for some congregants. The use of musical instruments is not allowed on the Sabbath and thus is forbidden from being played by more traditionally observant Jews. So, when Washington Hebrew purchased an organ in 1869, 35 families handed in resignation of their membership and sent off to create a new, more traditional congregation known as Adas Israel Synagogue. In what I consider to be a fabulously shady act, they gave their resignations on December 31st, 1869, likely so they wouldn't have to pay the 1870 dues. Go them. The Adas Israel Hebrew congregation was formally incorporated on September 9th, 1870. German Jews, particularly from the southeastern German region of Bavaria, comprised the bulk of the Jewish presence in the nation's capital before the Civil War and really formed the core of the founding members of Addis. For reasons that are unknown, the newly formed Adas Israel congregation decided soon after its formation to build a synagogue from the ground up rather than, converting a building as Washington Hebrew initially had. Though the budget was limited and the building itself was relatively small and modest, the act of building a new structure specifically for synagogue use as the first home of a new congregation was unusual, even somewhat audacious. It may be that there were no empty church buildings available for use, or maybe the congregation's founders felt that existing churches didn't offer the right configuration. We don't know for sure. Something to just predict, to think about. Anyway, so on February 13th, 1873, Adas Israel purchased this lot on Square 487 at the corner of 6th and G Street Northwest. We do know that a house stood on the lot, but by the end of the year, the congregation had decided to tear it down in order to save on property tax. The market crash of September 19th, 1873, and the severe recession following the Panic of 1873 forced the congregation to suspend its plans to build for some time. I want to pause here and note that a lot of the information I'll be sharing on this building comes from a historic structure report that was done in 2001 by the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington, our former institution. It is an incomplete picture, to say the least, especially in light of digitization efforts in the past 2 decades, which you'll hear me speak to. But the extensive research that was done provides really an invaluable insight into this modest house of worship. We would definitely like to do a new historic structures report, but we're a little preoccupied building a new museum at the moment. So maybe I can come back for DCPL's 60th anniversary and give you all updates. Adas Israel appointed several building committees between 1872 and 1876 in the course of its efforts to try and build a synagogue. Minutes and other records from the building committee itself have not survived, so there's no detailed information about the construction. Much of the information we have comes from meeting minutes from the general congregational meetings, which do provide some information. Unfortunately, we do not know for sure who designed the synagogue building. From the congregation's board discussion about payment of architects at the time, the congregation planned to have A. David and Sons build a synagogue for $7,500. It is evident that the planned building was in fact architect designed. When the congregation renewed its efforts to build in early 1876, it agreed at its February 20th meeting to accept a bid from a contractor named Joseph Williams to build a synagogue with a basement using, quote, plans and specifications already in possession of the congregation. So it cannot really be determined whether the 1875 plan was used, a modified version, or maybe a new set of plans altogether. The final cost of the building was about 2/3 of that 1875 plan, which suggests that there may have been some changes, if not a new design. What is rather startling is that the building was completed by the end of May 1876, a little over 3 months after the congregation voted to approve a contract for its construction. It's a small building, but that is a pretty quick time frame. So to try to better understand the building a little better, I do want to give some context of the place of the final design in American synagogue architecture, especially in the 19th century. So let's just get started with a synagogue itself. The basic requirements are few. There's the ark, the closed space that holds the Torah scrolls at the front. There's also the bima, the raised reading platform where most of the activity happens during the service, and perhaps a pulpit is the only other liturgical requirement. For the last 1,000 years, some form of seating has been normal, not in all places in the world. At first, benches surrounding the interior, allowing everyone to look inward, were the norm. In the 19th century, theatrical seating became more common in this form, with rows of benches facing the liturgical activity is now most common throughout the United States. Orthodox synagogues require separate seating for men and women. This remained common in America through much of the 19th century, though a gradual move towards family seating following the Protestant example was adopted. In part, this appears to have happened due to the adaptation of churches for synagogue use. The use of a women's gallery on 3 sides of the sanctuary was most common, and is actually what you see here in the original Addis sanctuary. Windows are important. Light is needed for reading, and with the prohibition against creating flame, later electricity, on the Sabbath, windows helped a great deal during the service especially. Synagogues should also, according to tradition, face Jerusalem. For European and American synagogues, that means that the axis looking towards the ark should be to the east. Urban congregations usually had less choice in the matter, depending on the pre-existing city block layout. Addis was fortunate to be able to achieve this east-facing axis even on their small lot at 6th and G. To our knowledge, the architecture of Adas Israel is not copied from any one synagogue or any other known building of any type in Europe or America at the time. Nonetheless, there is much that is familiar about the structure's design and arrangement. It does follow some standard forms, both regarding to its exterior construction and articulation and the interior plan. The sources for these are varied, and we can't say for sure what they are, but it's worth considering what some of the sources might have been. Urban synagogues, often in tight lots, were forced to squeeze function into difficult spaces or really exclude them altogether. For Addis, this meant stacking vertically. The lower level held an auxiliary space used for things like Hebrew school. There was also a mikveh, or ritual bath, in the lower level. You'll notice when you look at this side profile here that there's an uneven spacing between the 4 windows across the north and south side of the building. There's also a side entrance. This side entrance, in lack of window, allowed for privacy for those entering the ritual bath, and speaks to that sort of inconsistency in the symmetry. Classrooms, reception rooms, offices, libraries, they were not easily accommodated in many urban synagogues, though they might have been found in the immediate Jewish neighborhood normally. Rural and small town synagogue builders made more of a conscious effort to include or annex as many of these functions as possible, since the synagogue was truly the Jewish center of the town, or especially of the neighborhood or community. The inclusion of an auxiliary space in a mikveh in Adas Israel might be taken as an indication of the centrality of this synagogue in the congregation's lives and in the neighborhood as well. The upper level was the sanctuary. You'll notice the ark protruding out of the back. By sticking the ark outside, it allowed for more seating inside. We actually see this protruding ark architecture elsewhere in DC at Curatorial Israel Synagogue, the Orthodox synagogue in Georgetown, built in 1931. You'll notice in Curatorial Israel that the protruding ark is on the longer side. That's because in their city block layout, that's east facing. And so the seating sort of goes long ways as opposed to sort of down the center that you see in here in the Addis building. So moving back to the exterior, there are 3 main areas of inspiration that would have been available to the congregation when they were considering designs. And that should be sort of considered when thinking about how this synagogue came together. The broad tradition of synagogue architecture, particularly as articulated in Germany and Central Europe, the place of origin of most of the early congregants. The more specific and much newer tradition of American synagogue architecture, particularly synagogues in neighboring cities that congregants may have visited. And finally, and maybe most significantly, local building traditions in popular styles, especially those employed for houses of worship and other buildings used for public congregation, like meeting halls, schools, theaters. In America, the first Jewish communities really accepted what was then contemporary American styles, as can be seen in sort of the subdued Georgian classicism of the Torah Synagogue, the oldest synagogue in the United States, in Newport, Rhode Island, and the Greek revival in Adas Israel in New York City. That one in particular has since been demolished. Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, and Baltimore Hebrew Congregation in Baltimore, Maryland. Significantly, the builders of Adas Israel emphatically rejected the use of Moorish revival style for their new synagogue. This style was exploding in their native European Jewish communities, especially in the mid-19th century, and was extremely popular in America at the time when Addis was trying to come up with their design. Importantly, however, the two most prominent examples of the style, the Plum Street Synagogue in Cincinnati and Central Synagogue in New York City, were showcases of the Reform movement of Judaism, and therefore might have seemed unacceptable as a model for a congregation breaking away from a synagogue expressly because of the adoption of Reform practices. Then there's the local building traditions. The Romanesque revival style of Adas Israel and the use of red brick was very much in keeping with the prevailing public building construction at this time in Washington. There are countless examples of red brick buildings from the period, many of which remain to this day. One of the significant architects of the day in Washington, Adolf Kloos, had many public building projects underway at this very same time. There's Calvary Baptist Church in 1866, the Franklin School in 1868, the Sumner School in Eastern Market in 1871, and Center Market in 1872. And I just want to add how exciting it is to be living in this era of Adolf Kloos restoration. Hats off to Planet Word and Smithsonian for preserving the stunning Adolf Kloos buildings. And now I'm looking for someone to rebuild Center Market. Sure, we can find room somewhere. Maybe where RFK is. Kidding. Then there's another example that looks pretty parallel. The features of Saint Aloysius, the church at North Capitol and I, which was built in 1859, a red brick Romanesque revival style building that also has sort of an exaggerated verticality to it. The Addis building is significantly smaller. It's a little hard to tell on this side by side, but it gives us another sort of hint into it. As I mentioned before, the congregation was somehow able to complete the synagogue in only 3 months. And on June 9th, 1876, the synagogue was officially dedicated. Among those in attendance was then President Ulysses S. Grant, who later made a $10 donation to the congregation, as seen here in this note. Thankfully, the press was also in attendance. Most of what is known about the appearance of the building and its role as a synagogue comes from detailed descriptions in early articles published after the dedication. And on the right side here is the only known photograph of the interior of the sanctuary, published later in 1903 in the Washington Times. There are no known photographs of the lower level during its time in the congregation. We only have the descriptions in the newspaper. Here we have one of the earliest known photos of the exterior from the collection of our friends at DC History Center. And it's believed to be taken sometime between 1898 and 1907. You'll see, just for reference, two people, my cursor, but two people at the bottom right next to the sanctuary to give a little bit of size reference, size comparison. It's also important to note another feature, or rather lack thereof, on the exterior of Washington's first purpose-built synagogue. This small stone at the top of the building's main entrance is the only external identifier as a Jewish space, and you really would have to squint your eyes. The carving on the stone reads in Hebrew, Beit Adas Israel, which is the Hebrew for Congregation Adas Israel, and followed by the year in the Hebrew calendar in which it was constructed. One possibility for the lack of outward Jewish expression may have to do with the very immigrants that helped found the congregation. Many likely faced anti-Semitism in their native Europe and may have been hesitant or even anxious to be outwardly visible in what the purpose of this building was used for. excuse me. The influx of Eastern European Jews to America, including Washington, D.C., in the 1890s led the rapidly expanding congregation to conclude a new synagogue must be built. In 1891, Addis purchased the adjacent lot at 617 6th Street. And by 1900, the Jewish population in Washington had grown to 4,000. In 1901, then Addis Rabbi J.T. Loeb had proposed a plan to expand the synagogue, either by tearing down both buildings and building on the double lot, or by sort of connecting the two. But the plan was later abandoned because the site was too small, and he was quoted in the Evening Star as saying the rumbling of the streetcars and other street noises were too disruptive to religious worship. What was understood is that a new site was needed, and they found one just up 6th Street at the corner of 6th and I. This was the Adas Israel second location, built in 1907. The new, larger, more ornate building is indicative of economic success, generations after the immigrant generation, growth in the number of congregants, and the liberty with which Jews in America felt safe to express identity. More confident in expressing their faith, the Grand Synagogue at the corner of 6th and I was ornamented with numerous symbols of Judaism, in stark contrast to their first, much more humble home. So the sale of the original Adas Israel at 6th and G was part of the plan for financing the construction of the new synagogue at 6th and I. The two lots were sold together on May 26, 1905, to a man named Stephen Gotti, who had already purchased several other buildings in the area. The congregation had specified that all of the furniture, benches, etc., in the synagogue were not to be included in the sale. They were going to take them with them. And when they sold the synagogue to Stephen Gotti, they arranged to rent the building from him until the new synagogue was built. While alterations to the building under the congregation's ownership were almost none, under Gotti, there were many. In December 1907, he applied for 2 permits to ready the building for its new tenants. Both were to modify the G Street side of the building. The ground floor was to be converted into commercial space, while the upstairs was to be occupied by a church. In 1909, Gotti filed for a permit to cut out a window from the front elevation and replace it with a door and exterior iron staircase, which you can see in this picture here. The 1909 doorway and iron steps leading up to the entrance had been a source of confusion about the original appearance of the building. The Historic American Building Survey report that was done in 1969 did not include permit research, and they stated that the door and entrance definitely appeared to be original. However, we know this not to be true because this drawing on the left that accompanied permit 859 describes the side door as the new walk and the central door as the present walk. We also know Gotti removed the left staircase inside that went up to the sanctuary to allow for more room in the downstairs shop. The first proprietor of the newly renovated synagogue space was Harry Seamark. He was issued permits to build show windows on both the 6th and G Street elevations in 1909. I do want to give special thanks to the New York Public Library, who, thanks to their digitization efforts, provided us with the first ever known photographs, not only of Seamark's shop, but also of the lower level of the synagogue. They were featured in a multi-page spread on Seamark in a 1916 issue of Motorcycle Illustrated. The first images of the lower level we have, unfortunately, are after it was converted for commercial use, so we again don't know what it looked like during the synagogue years. From 1910 to 1968, close to 24 tenants occupied the former synagogue building, including a motorcycle shop, a soap shop, multiple barbershops, and our personal favorite, a barbecue carryout. Nothing quite clues you into the fact that this structure is no longer used as a synagogue as much as a neon pig hanging from the side of the building. Meanwhile, upstairs, the sanctuary space of the synagogue was occupied by a succession of churches, and in the final years served as storage space for the shops below. The first church known to have occupied the space was St. Sophia, the Greek Orthodox church that's now located in Upper Northwest on Mass Ave. St. Sophia was formally organized in 1904, and they met in a few other locations before moving into the former synagogue. They were there from 1910 to the early 1920s. For most of the 60 plus years that the Gotti family owned the synagogue, the ground floor had 3 shops, and the upstairs again was used sometimes for churches and sometimes for storage. There was 1 shop on the 6th Street side that bore the address 619, and 2 shops that faced the G Street side. One was 516 G Street, which sometimes in the directory was listed as 518 to just confuse us as we try and do research. And another one on 6th Street, sort of more on the eastern end of the building, that had 514. You may recognize A La Terry, the infamous Italian grocery store near Union Market, which actually spent its first few years in existence in the former synagogue. The final 3 tenants were among the building's longest occupants during the Gotti years: Benny's Barbershop at 514, Veterans Market, a grocery store owned by the Moy family, at 516, and on the 6th Street side, Purity Foods, a carryout owned by the Contos family. This matchbox is the first and only piece of material culture from one of the actual businesses that occupied the historic synagogue during the Gotti years. Huge thanks to John DeFerrari, who tweeted a picture of it. I immediately tweeted back, and he agreed to donate it to the museum from his personal collection. We do hope to collect other original material culture from these businesses. If anyone happens to have an extra early 20th century flying Merkel motorcycle lying around, we would love one from our collection. So Adas Israel congregation moved from 6th and I to their 3rd and current location in Cleveland Park in 1951. By the 1960s, the role of this first synagogue building had largely been forgotten. In 1965, Henry Glassy, who is a lawyer and Washington historian, pointed out to his partner, Herschel Shanks, that building had in fact been the first synagogue in DC. Shanks then wrote to Bernard Nordlinger, the president of the Jewish Historical Society at the time, suggesting that someone in the Jewish community might be interested in either turning it into a museum or making it into a space for the Historical Society. The Jewish Historical Society, which was founded in 1960, initially explored the question of whether the building could be purchased from the Gotti family, but really had little luck. About a year later, Evelyn Greenberg, who's also part of the Historical Society at the time, found herself, seemingly by sheer chance, near the Decanter House location of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She recounted that on an impulse, she entered and explained to a staff member her interest in an old downtown synagogue building. The staff member responded, "A downtown landmark? There's a meeting on that this afternoon." Thus began a long and weird journey to reclaim and restore Washington's first purpose-built synagogue. Initially, this was a campaign to purchase and restore the building. However, the situation changed dramatically when Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority determined that it needed the building's site and really the entire block on which it stood for the construction of their headquarters. Wamada planned to purchase and demolish the building, and thus this turned into a rescue effort. This cute little model of the building from 1967 was used as a tool both in fundraising and lobbying elected officials to save the synagogue. And it was designed to show the desired restoration of the building. You can see both on the exterior and the interior to rebuild the sanctuary. In March 1967, the Joint Landmarks Committee of the National Capital Planning Commission and the Fine Arts Commission voted to place the building on Washington's landmark list. Then in March 1968, the same committee designated it a higher category 2 landmark in the District of Columbia. And this saved the building from almost certain demolition by Wamada, but really didn't solve any problems. Okay, so here comes the bureaucratic minefield part that I talked about at the beginning. In June 1968, a conference was held between the DC government, the DC Department of Highways, Wamada, HUD, the Planning Commission, and the Jewish Historical Society. An end agreement, a very complicated ending agreement was reached. Essentially, the DC government would provide a site on a vacant triangular remnant of land near the freeway construction to be made available by the highway department. The city council will apply for a HUD historic preservation grant to cover half the cost of moving and restoring the building. The Jewish Historical Society would provide the other half through fundraising to match for the grant. Wamada would donate the building and allow for time for removal, and the Planning Commission would prepare the site for the new location, and then HUD would provide the grant for restoration. Simple enough. Not quite. When the HUD grant and the application for the site acquisition came under review, the City Corporation Council found that the District of Columbia government did not have the authority under existing law at the time to enter into an agreement for the preservation of historic buildings. This authority could only be granted by an act of Congress, statehood, cough, cough. The text of the bill was drafted, hearings were held. The bill was enacted by both houses of Congress and signed by the president in September 1969. Record time, even for an unopposed bill. That same year, the building was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the second ever Jewish house of worship after the Curatorial Synagogue in Newport to receive that designation. So now with everything in place bureaucratically, on a very freezing cold day of December 18th, 1969, the 270-ton building, belted and braced, was lifted onto 28 wheels, a 3-section dolly, and pulled through the city of Washington by 2 tractors. It was overseen by William B. Patram of Fairfax, and it moved down G Street between the GAO and Pension buildings to its new home from 6th and G to 3rd and G. It did receive quite a lot of press coverage, which helps us in better understanding the story, including a slight incident that occurred. A traffic control box at 5th and G burst into flames just after the synagogue was driven by. Apparently, the weight of the synagogue ruptured a gas line. The fire was allowed to burn to prevent any dangerous buildup of gas. Spectators that day actually stood near the flames to keep warm because it was so bitter cold. And one was even quoted in the article as saying, "The miracle of moving a synagogue brought on another miracle, the burning bush." Because a significant of the portion of the ground level had been altered so much during the Gotti years, the base of the building was not considered strong enough to withstand the move. So the building was cut from its base at about 12 feet above ground. The building was set on a new foundation and efforts were made to match the new brick, and some old brick was actually salvaged from the pile to be used in the restoration in the 1970s. As the building was being prepared to move, remnants of the mikvah, the ritual bath, were actually found in the rear of the building under the floor of the former barbershop. Pictured are Ann Kipnis Nussbaum, Pearl Kipnis, and Dorothy Kipnis, early Addis members who were able to identify the location of the mikvah. After Wamada headquarters was completed, this plaque was put on the side of the building, of the Wamada building, on the site where the historic synagogue once stood, and can still be seen there to this day. So despite all the changes in the Gotti years, several features were considered to still be original. The high, narrow windows of the second floor, topped by these fan-shaped fluted lunettes, the enclosed wooded bay, the arc jutting out of what was originally the eastern wall, the roof cupola, and the semicircle plaque at the top were all seen as original. Surprisingly, the sanctuary was fairly intact. The original arc on the inside was still there. It was used as a broom closet by the last tenants. The window trim, wainscoting, arc doors, and pediment had really not been materially damaged. The back portion of the women's gallery and its supports still stood, although the sides had been taken off. They believe during the storage years. But upon examination of the original flooring by the restoration team, they could ascertain the location of the original posts or columns where the balcony once stood, as well as where the original bima, that raised platform in the beginning, first was, which helped in the restoration process. So with all of that, the plans for restoration were drawn up by architect Leon Brown. In the restoration, the ground floor spaces were actually designed to meet the needs of the Jewish Historical Society. No attempt really was made to recreate the original space, in part because we had no original images and the descriptions were not very helpful, even in the newspapers. The spiral staircase from the ground level to the sanctuary were installed. The stairs on the west side were reintroduced that had been taken out by Gotti, and the exterior iron staircase and sort of second door were removed. Preliminary paint research had identified the original paint colors. It was white for the vestibule woodwork and clear lacquer for the wainscoting in the sanctuary. I told you I'd be talking a lot about wainscoting. The arc paint color and inscription was restored in 1970, as was the 10 Commandment tablets. The prayer, the original prayer that was painted above the original ark, actually can be found in the current Adas Israel Sanctuary, though on a much, much, much larger scale, but you can see it wrapped around the top of the sanctuary here. So as I said before, it was put on a new foundation and bricks were either replaced or restored. Restoration was slow, partially due to fundraising, but also in part due to the active construction going on all around it. Another big thank you for the wonders of digitization. I recently stumbled upon a series of previously unknown photos of the synagogue from this sort of in-between time in the early 70s. They are part of the DC Department of Transportation's historical collection. They are digitizing things and putting them online. If you haven't gone on their website, I encourage you to after this. They were taken by DDOT. These photos were taken by DDOT during the construction of 395, the 3rd Street Tunnel. I absolutely must give special thanks to Katie Crabb, the DDOT archivist, for her efforts to digitize this, what I'm sure is massive collection, and her willingness to donate copies of these DDOT photos of the synagogue to the museum, to our collection. So in 1973, while renovations were happening, the Historical Society, in partnership with Adas Israel Congregation, held the first Jewish prayer service in over 6 decades in the building, as sort of a symbol of its return to Jewish roots. These 2 older gentlemen here were invited to participate in the service, Louis Marks and Hyman Goodman, both of whom had had their bar mitzvah in the original Adas Israel Sanctuary when it was originally used as a synagogue. In 1965, the Historical Society installed a wrought iron fence. They did not try and replicate the plain iron fencing that was visible in some of those early photographs, but rather gave this design of alternating Star of Davids and menorahs. The fence was manufactured by Gitchner Ironworks and was donated by Henry and Joseph Gitchner in memory of their parents, Tina and Fred Gitchner, who had prayed in the original synagogue. I do also just want to note, I had mentioned the importance of facing east towards Jerusalem. But the size and shape of this sort of awkward triangular space that was given to the Historical Society for the synagogue necessitated rotating the building 90 degrees. So the front elevation, rather than facing west, now faced south. And this rotation compromised the historical integrity of the synagogue space since it no longer had the arc facing east. On June 22nd, 1975, the building was rededicated as the Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum. For the years of the Historical Society, they brought lectures, school groups, and many Jewish life cycle events into the restored synagogue space, as well as efforts to collect around the history of the Washington Jewish community. You may have remembered, I mentioned 79 years earlier, the furniture was not included in the sale of the building to Stephen Gotti. Instead, it was believed that Addis brought the furniture with them to the new location at 6th and I. In 1984, 2 of the original pews were found in the balcony of 6th and I when Turner Memorial AME Church, who occupied the building since the 1950s, was renovating it. They donated the pews to the Jewish Historical Society and returned the pews to the original sanctuary. And we now have 3 that will be in, as well as replicas that will be in the sanctuary. There were no major alterations to the building once it was restored in the early 1970s during the Historical Society years. The building did need to do some restoration after the earthquake of 2011, which left cracks in the masonry, interior sanctuary walls, and the brick patio. Nothing compared to your tour yesterday of National Archives. I'm sorry, not National Archives, National Cathedral, who had much more extensive damage. Some decades after its first rescue, this little brick building was once again in the way of redevelopment. Plans were in place to deck over 395 with new office buildings, restaurants, hotels, etc. And so once again, the synagogue needed to be moved. This time, not as far, but some of the lower level would again need to be cut. So in preparation of that, the stairs were once again removed. The lower level window fan decor and the cornerstone were removed and preserved. The lower windows were taken out and bricked up, and massive holes were created along the bottom for support beams. Actually, when they were cutting out the cinder blocks, they found these 2 beer cans inside, likely from the 1970s renovation. So first came the beams, which hydraulics lifted the building off the ground. Then came the wheels, many wheels, many more than in the original move. And on November 3rd, 2016, the synagogue moved for a second time. The second journey was a much shorter one, just out into 3rd Street, while the site it sat on and the site it was heading to were dug out to allow for the construction of parking garages underneath what would become the various buildings. And since it had become such an expert on moving through the city, why not do it for a third time? In January 2019, once the site of its future home was prepared, the synagogue was placed back on its wheels and moved, hopefully for the final time, to its new home at the corner of 3rd and F to sit as the centerpiece of the new Capital Jewish Museum. It was 96 wheels and a man with an iPad driving it down the street. Quite terrifying to watch, but fun nonetheless. This photo is in case the video didn't work. So now that it was on its newest foundation, brickwork began once again. I love this photo in particular because you can see 3 really distinct layers of brick, which I think nicely represent each of its moves and each of its eras. Another fantastic view on the inside, you can see how high the cinder blocks go and where the bricks start from all the times of it being cut. And this is a nice view of the some of the paint stripped down so you can see the original wood in the sanctuary. The plaque was taken down for the moves and actually underwent 3D scanning. The original plaque is going to be displayed in the exhibition, and a replica from the 3D scan is going to be placed on the outside. This is a nice little collage courtesy of buyer Blinder Bell, who helped with this work. I particularly love the wood on the stairs in the sanctuary that just like glow. It's all sort of coming together nicely. As many of you know, especially in this audience, historic buildings are often especially challenging due to their lack of accessibility. The historic Adas Israel Synagogue is no different. For the past 146 years, the 2nd floor sanctuary was only accessible via narrow spiral staircases. But we are adding this bridge from the new synagogue directly into the sanctuary, which will allow the first purpose-built synagogue in our nation's capital to be more fully accessible, which we're really particularly excited about. So what comes next for our storied building? It will sit as the centerpiece of the new Capital Jewish Museum. To be clear, our museum is not just about this building. It's not just about Adas Israel, but it's really a history of the whole Jewish community of Greater Washington. It will tell the stories of individuals who came to make and remake Jewish Washington, individuals of various backgrounds with different countries of origins, languages, skills, and political ideas. Our hope is that visitors will connect, reflect, and act on the history of the Jewish community that they learn, and that sits at this intersection of American Judaism and American democracy. I can assure you we are putting the historic synagogue building to work. That lower level, that auxiliary space, will be a sort of more traditional chronological history of the Jewish community. The sanctuary is being restored, but also we'll have this very cool audiovisual experience to teach the history of the building itself. Over here will be, in the new building will be the main exhibit space, which will be more thematic. Talking about things like who is Jewish Washington, where is Jewish Washington, I'm talking about the built environment. And also looking at the ways people came to Washington to participate in democracy. Things like voting, protesting, lobbying, running for office, journalism, all these different things that are really central to our democracy. And on the third floor space, we'll have a fairly sizable temporary exhibit space. We'll get to do exhibits of our own, but when the museum first opens, we'll be welcoming in Notorious RBG, the exhibit from the Skirball Museum in LA on the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And on the top floor, in addition to our offices, we'll have our archive. I'm a big proponent for accessibility to collections, and hopefully we'll be able to do a lot more digitization of our own, but also make the collection more accessible to our visitors. So in the meantime, construction continues, both on restoring the synagogue and building a new museum around it. And we hope to be able to welcome you all in once we're done, likely in early 2023. I want to thank DC Preservation League and Melissa for allowing me to get so nerdy about this building. I really had a lot of fun diving in on a much deeper level. I learned a lot in the process of putting this presentation together. And I also want to thank the staff of the Capitol Jewish Museum. It is not easy trying to build a museum and design exhibits virtually during a pandemic, but it's made easier and much more worth it when you are lucky enough to work with a team as incredible as the one I'm with. So, and I thank them for their patience in me putting this together and talking about it nonstop. I think we have questions. Thank you all so much, and hopefully we can move to questions.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Jonathan, thank you so much. That was such a just wonderful and beautiful look at the history of this building. And I think I'm speaking for everybody in saying that we are so excited for this museum. So thank you so much for this. You know, as folks are thinking of questions, I also want to introduce or give him the chance to introduce himself, Stuart Zuckerman, who is the president of the museum's board of directors. So Stuart is also here, and he will be answering any questions that you all might have too. So Stuart, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm the president of the board of directors, but I'm also a longtime member of the Jewish Historical Society and now the Jewish Museum. Me and colleagues on the board were instrumental in making the arrangements to move the museum, to get the project entitled, along with Kara Blond, our executive director. And I just wanted to thank her and the rest of the staff, and look forward to hearing any of your questions.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so okay, let's get to it. So first off, I think it's more of like a clarifying question. But Susan wants to know, I guess she was confused. She said the brick building, well, the building that we spoke about was the first purpose-built synagogue. But then she mentions like the big stone building that is now New Hope Baptist has Stars of David carved over the doors. Does that indicate a building built as a synagogue?
Yeah, yes, so that's where it's a little confusing. Washington Hebrew Congregation is the first congregation of our nation's capital, but they were praying out of a converted church until 1898. Addis, which was the second congregation, built the first synagogue, the first purpose-built synagogue in 1876. So that the building that Greater New Hope is now in was in fact a synagogue, but it was built in 1898, a number of years after Addis. That's, okay. Yes, it's a little confusing.
That was great, thanks. Claire said, super cool about the CMARC photos. Several other images included were new to me as well. Have there been related new collections acquired or discovered in recent years? You mentioned what John, who's on our board, what he had been able to donate. Are you getting anything else, or where can people, I guess, contact you too? Sorry, that was like.
Yeah, oh no, sorry. Yeah, I mean, specifically related to the building, most of what we've gotten in recent years, I shared. It was funny. So I was reading the Historic Structures Report from 2001, and they specifically said there's no known photos of the early commercial tenants of the museum. And I was like, guess what? We found some. And so, yeah, the C-Mark photos were a particularly exciting find because those he was the first tenant. And again, that's one of the many wonderful things about when we digitize our collections and make them more accessible is we can really uncover this history. But besides that, again, if anyone wants to donate a Merkle motorcycle, we would love one. But there's unfortunately not much from especially the tenant years that we have in the collection.
Okay, well, this is good to know. And I will put, I'm going to put right now your website into the chat, which I'm sure has contact information on there. So if people do have something or know somebody or anything, please do reach out to them. And also social media handle as well for the museum. So that's in there. Okay, so our next question is, Anne wants to know, in Jewish ritual, is there a formal decommissioning of a synagogue building as a sacred space? Just to compare, there's a similar thing in regard to Catholic churches.
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge, Stuart. I don't know if you can speak to this, but I know for Jewish ritual texts, like a prayer book and things like that, there are very specific things to do. With the building itself, to my knowledge, I don't believe so. Stuart, do you know?
No, I don't. I don't think that.
No.
I don't believe that there is, but I don't actually know.
It is interesting in doing the research just on all the synagogues of DC. I found a lot on the number of synagogues that started downtown that like almost every single one became a church. And so if there is a decommissioning process, I have not heard of it, but if there is one, it would have had to happen in almost every single one of these buildings.
Yeah. Great. So Richard, I can't see the other name. Richard asks, are you asking for materials or oral histories from people who grew up in the DC area over the last century at all?
So yes, so our collecting efforts are a little bit on pause while we build the new museum. But yes, so our collecting scope is of sort of the greater DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia Jewish community. From as early as the Jewish community has been here. Yeah, and I'm happy, again, my contact information is on the website. I'm happy to talk to people one-on-one about the scope. We're hoping once we're in the new building to also resume doing oral histories with people who grew up here. Absolutely, yes. Always looking to collect.
Yes. Okay, Anne just wanted to say thank you so much, Jonathan. I learned so much from your presentation. And I hope you're seeing the other compliments, Jonathan. Everybody really enjoyed your presentation. Yeah, and Lawrence wants to know, can you tell us more about who the Smalls were?
Stuart, I'll let you take that one.
The Smalls are a multi-generational Washingtonian family that are in the real estate development business, but also very, very tied in to or very interested on a multi-generationally in the preservation of Washington artifacts. So Lillian and Albert Small were very, very interested in artifacts related to the Washington. Their son, Albert, who just passed away recently, unfortunately, was very, very dedicated to collecting Washingtonia and had a very extensive collection and was very deeply interested in Washington history of all sorts. His office was really a treat to look at. The family itself dedicated a library, I think it's a rare books library at the University of Virginia, They're also instrumental in the museum at George Washington and generally dedicated to Washington and collecting artifacts. So the Jewish Historical Society, now the Jewish Capitol Jewish Museum, are a natural continuation of their longstanding interest in the community, but also the longstanding interest in Washington history.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Somebody asked, is there one specific repository of the documents of the synagogue, the people rather than the building, from the original location?
That's a great question. There are actually a number of synagogues in DC that have their own archives in their synagogues, including Adas Israel. We have many of the synagogue's archives in our own collection, but primarily because we don't have the space. We aren't taking all those archives in quite yet. We're hoping to do a project to help synagogues digitize them, but a lot of the synagogues do have their own archives, and a lot of wonderful congregants who volunteer to organize and help preserve and then answer my emails when I want to look for something in a lot of these synagogues, including Addis, Washington Hebrew. Yeah.
Great. So Sharon asks, will the plaque on the Wamada building indicating the original location be preserved when Wamada is torn down?
It's a great question. Someone actually just asked me that the other day. Yeah, I think we're gonna definitely try and get it. It's not, I mean, the plaque is from the 1970s. So we can also maybe put a new one up, depending on what goes there. Maybe we'll move the synagogue back to its original location. No more moving. We're done moving it. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yes, and I'm interested to see what happens with that space, but we are hoping to still have some sort of marker that represents what was once there.
That's great. Yeah, and speaking of the move, I remember everybody in our office, we were like watching the live cast, like stream of it. It was amazing. The third move. So yeah.
Which one?
Yeah, which one is it?
Yeah, no, it was it was really impressive. I actually was not working for the museum yet. I was in grad school, and my teacher had mentioned something about it, and I had time between classes, so I went over there, and I was like, this is so bizarre. I mean, just watching the synagogue slowly, it's like a historic building, but and it was really just a man with an iPad controlling these like 96 wheels in this like 140 something year old building. And I was anxious myself. I don't know how he was able to do it.
I'll remind you, it actually wasn't that slow. That thing moved pretty quickly, actually.
Oh, did it? Oh, was it? Oh my gosh, that makes it even scarier.
I know.
So,
Moving. It was definitely moving.
I had no idea about the man with the iPad, so that is that's nuts. Yeah.
Probably not how it worked in 1969.
No, probably not. Yeah, it would be interesting to see how that worked, how like they did that back then. Okay, let's see. Waiting for some questions. I'll see if we have anything from Facebook.
Oh, I see one. Are there some enduring structural weaknesses that the multiple moves of the structure caused that complicated its establishment in the final location? Stuart?
Yes. Yes, the answer is no. So we've had, it's a good question because obviously, looking at it, but we've had engineers review the building, and it is structurally sound, because that was something that we definitely reviewed. Some things we did do to bring it up to code is that we strengthened the flooring on the inside so that it meets current code. As Jonathan mentioned, it does, the bottom of the half of the bottom third or quarter of the building had been removed in 1968. So that helped in our ability to make the building structurally sound and to evaluate it properly. So yeah, no, that's definitely a question to be looked at, and we did.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I guess I kind of have a question as we wait for folks if they think of anything else. It's always so interesting to see how a historic building might be incorporated to be a part of like a newer building, right? So maybe is there more information you can tell us about like what has that process looked like? Any challenges like making these two buildings kind of coexist, I guess?
Jonathan, you want to, or I can
The only thing I'll say is we kind of see it as our largest artifact.
Yeah.
And so while it's like incorporating it into the building, it's almost so like you're never allowed to touch artifacts in museums, but like this is one you get to go into. Stuart, you can speak more to it.
Yeah, so incorporating that, so really it's all one museum, right? From a structural point of view and from every other point of view, it becomes a single structure. So yes, it is complicated. I mean, the connection points have to be very delicate because you can't, disturb the historic fabric of the building. So the points at which, so the lobby and everything else at the museum has to function as a single building. The connection points have to be very, very delicate yet tight. So that is very complicated. Those connection points are very complex. Even by the standards of some very experienced architects and engineers, that's a very complex operation. So that is definitely one thing. Structurally, you have to make sure that nothing really bears upon the museum, the synagogue. Also, that's also a complicated operation. And then there's some tricky fire code issues to resolve too. So I can get further into it, but it is a very difficult process to bring utilities into there and to make sure that it doesn't bear any weight and that it's fully connected. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. But I'm sure well worth it. Yeah.
But very worth it, because what ends up happening architecturally with this is that, the building itself, as you saw from some renderings, it's a modernist building. It really is. And what happens is that the synagogue, which forms half of the lobby, adds a tremendous amount of texture to the building and really, really brings the whole structure alive, in my view. And so we're going to emphasize that. We're going to have up lights onto the brick walls, both outside the museum envelope and also inside the lobby. So at certain points, you can really see and put on display the brick. And I think Jonathan had mentioned that there's 3 levels of bricks. There's all sorts of mortar and brick and all sorts of things going on the side of that wall. And all of it is an historic artifact, but just brings a tremendous amount of visual richness to the building and to the visual history of the building too. So it really reads as an historic document, but also it's just a beautiful piece of art. So
yeah, I can't wait to see it. It's definitely going to be stunning. And I hope people do realize just the amount of work that goes into creating something like that. So thank you. Let's see. Okay, so Lawrence asks, does the museum own the land where it is now located?
Should I take that one, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, the answer is yes. We have what's known as, people on this call probably know, we have fee simple ownership of the property, but it is at ground level. So from the ground up, we own the property in fee simple. We have, if anyone's interested, we have easement rights and all sorts of things, rights to the below grade area for parking needs, for utilities, and for access of all sorts. So yes, we do own it.
Great.
I'm excited about the next question because I didn't talk about it, and because clearly I had more than enough to talk about. So someone asked, any idea where the original Torah scrolls from the synagogue are today? That's such a good question. Okay, so Addis, this first purpose-built synagogue was built because they broke off from Washington Hebrew congregation. The early members of Addis actually wrote a letter, which we have in our collection, to Washington Hebrew, asking if they could, if Washington Hebrew could loan them a Torah scroll for the dedication, which Washington Hebrew agreed to despite all the drama, which was very nice. But then some of the founders, the Gott Health family, actually ended up donating the first Torah scroll to Adas Israel, and that was one of the primary Torah scrolls used. It made its way to 6th and I and up to Cleveland Park, and the Torah scroll is still with the congregation today, and they are very generously giving it to us to bring back into the Ark, into the original sanctuary. So when we open and it is used as a sanctuary again, the original Torah scrolls will be Torah scroll rather will be returned into the Ark, and we're very excited about that.
That is so exciting. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I love that. It's wonderful. And Anne agrees. She's like, wonderful. She loves that. Yeah. So yeah, and Isabel asks, as for the building being brick, please correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't George Washington set up a building regulation for DC that all buildings should be brick to cut down on building fires? Interesting question.
I don't know the history of this, but I bet somebody on this DC Preservation League call would know. So if someone wants to put in the chat, but yeah, that's very possible. I don't know. I mean, maybe there are other stone construction. I'm thinking of like the patent office, which was not brick. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't answer incorrectly, but
it's really any regulation that existed certainly doesn't survive till today. There's plenty of not brick.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, please feel free to put that in the chat. Let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions here. I'm gonna call out, see if there's any Facebook questions at all. In the meantime, let me scroll through the chat. No Facebook questions. Got a shy crowd over there.
Or I just talk too much.
No, seriously, Jonathan, that was absolutely wonderful. That was really great. The visuals, I just love all those pictures so much.
I'm a very visual learner, so yes. I just flash lots of pictures in my presentations because I think it's helpful. Absolutely,
no, it is. And I'm sure that's like only a snippet of what you have in your collection, so I for sure cannot wait to see what ends up in the museum. Let's see. Okay, I think we do have another question. Okay, in addition to the Torah scroll, are there any other direct connections between the contemporary Adas Israel congregation and the new museum?
Yeah, I mean, there's, with having their first building as sort of the centerpiece of the museum, there is connection. Again, we have a lot of sort of their archives in our archives, and a lot of the sort of history overlaps. But again, it is, while today was focused on that first building and so focused on the original Adas Israel, it is not what the museum will primarily be focused on. It's really focused on the entire history of the greater Washington Jewish community. But Addis has been a great partner and friend to the museum and advocate for the museum. So we're excited about that. And obviously they have a passion for this history as well. And we're grateful to be partners with them.
Yeah, that's great. Juliet asks, and I think you might have mentioned this, but I'm not sure, but plans for use of the synagogue itself. So like any services?
Mm-hmm. Just like within the Historical Society days, our hope is to bring Jewish life back into that sanctuary for various life cycle events. There's no like set service, but we're hoping that different things will come into play. Again, not far away in the same neighborhood, Sixth and I. It also does a lot of services in downtown Washington, so we're hoping to do partnerships with them. Obviously, they have a much bigger sanctuary than we do. It's a small size, but then also the sanctuary is going to have this very cool sort of audio-visual immersive experience to teach the history of the building. Don't worry, I'm not going to be the one narrating it. That was just today, but where there'll be projections and things like that, while still keeping the integrity of the historic building. So yeah, it's going to have multiple uses. We're not reinstalling a mikveh. There's not going to be an active ritual bath. That's going to be an exhibit gallery downstairs, but one that will have a lot of cool history and some great artifacts, including that little model of the synagogue.
I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. Great, wonderful. Well, it is now like 1:15, so unfortunately we have to end things here, but I want to say thank you again so much, Jonathan. That was a beautiful presentation. We really learned a lot. And thank you again, Stuart, especially for sharing like your expertise and like how the historic building is going to be, used with the new building. So this is all so much great information. I know we're also excited to follow what's going on with the museum, to see it in the future, and to visit ourselves. So thank you so much. I put the Capital Jewish Museum website back into the chat, everybody, as well as their social media handles. So please go follow them and support them. If there's any other last words either of you have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks. And yeah, so before we end things, I just want to let folks know what we have planned next for our 50th anniversary. So in January, we are looking at historic places of transportation, and we have a couple of cool things planned for that. So details will be coming out for that soon. So you can, sign up for a newsletter, follow us on social media, or just keep an eye on our calendar. But we hope that you will join us in 2022 as we are approaching the end of our anniversary celebration. So it's been a really great year for us. So anyway, so thank you so much. If there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@dcpreservation.org. We'll pass it along to Jonathan and Stuart. And thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in 2022.